What is up? Today we're using Europa to build some rhythmic chords, which are kind of subtle and fit nicely into a breakdown kind of part in your track. This is what they sound like in my latest track, Never Over, which you can check out now if you haven't already. Link in the description. So that's what they sound like. Let's build them in Europa. So check in a new instance. And first up, we're going to build the basis for our sound. And I like to use the FM feedback wavetable instead of a classic saw wave. And I'll bring the shape up to about 31.3%, which is kind of a messed up saw tooth, but it sounds kind of nice. Then we'll use modifier 1 on the octave setting under harmonics, and we'll bring the amount up to about 26 to add some more brightness. Now we're going to use this kind of fat foundation, and we're going to make it a little bit lighter, a little bit emptier, using the Spectral Filter in Comb Plus mode with a resonance of about 56% and the frequency at about 31.3. This takes away a lot of the meat of the sound, but if we later have a bass running under these chords, like we do in the breakdown I just showed you, it'll still feel very full, and these chords just provide the subtle rhythmic elements on top. If you're looking for fat sawtooth chords, you definitely wouldn't want to get rid of all the meat using the Spectral Filter. But let's continue on, and later we can A-B the sound. But for now, let's turn on the harmonics and switch to odd even, bringing the position all the way down for now, and the amount as well. This eliminates all the overtones of the sound which are not in a square wave, which turns our sound into a squarey kind of sound, but we'll actually use the position knob and bring it up a little bit, so it's not a full square, but rather something in between. And it makes the sound a little bit warmer, so I have the position at about 18% right now. So let's spread it out using unison in normal mode, bringing up the spread a little bit and bringing down the blend a little bit. So now we have our nice kind of glassy foundation, which we run into the filter, bringing up the drive to about 70% and bringing down the frequency to, well, almost all the way, and using envelope 1 with an amount of about 78% to control the frequency. So the first thing you'll want to do on the envelope itself is to beat sync it and switch on to global, which ensures that all the notes that you play will be, well, they will be modulated in the same way when you hit global. So we'll bring up the speed to 1/4, and I'll also switch the BPM to 140. And now you can get a little bit creative here. The pattern that I used for my rhythmic pattern of the chords is simply placing one anchor point, just one kind of step behind the center step, and then building a little sawtooth right here, like this, and then using the anchor step right above here to build another sawtooth. I'm just double clicking to add anchors. And then for the very last step, I use a little bit of a fade, but I'll curve that very drastically, so it's very subtle fade back into the first one. And you can get creative here and see, build a pattern that works for you, but this is the one that I kind of chose for Never Over. It has a spring to it, kind of like a canter sound, whatever. Anyway, let's use envelope 1 on the octave modifier of our engine as well, bringing that up to about 64%. Just adds a little bit more dynamic in the higher frequencies. And next up, we'll go to the effects section and use the Equalizer first to just scoop out some frequencies at 220 Hertz, which this kind of setup is very rich in, so we'll just reduce those. Sorry for the clipping. Let's also bring down the master volume to about 4 dB. So now we have our very subtle kind of sound, which is what we're going for. Let's use a phaser to add some more interesting elements. So we can bring up the spread a little bit, reduce the depth, reduce the amount. Then we'll use distortion to add a little bit of grit, switching it to tube mode, reducing the drive a little bit, bringing up the tone and reducing the amount to about halfway. You can play with the drive. I like very subtle settings which just add a little bit of grit. Next up, and very importantly, is the delay. So as you can hear right now, our pattern is kind of dull and boring, but turning on the delay on 3/16 will add a lot of steps in between the rhythmic pattern and it'll make it a lot more interesting. So let's bring up the amount and the feedback to about 12 o'clock. And we don't want any ping-ponging in our delay because we already spread the sound with the unison, but of course you can get creative and figure out some settings that work for you. So this is where the sound gets interesting, using the delay on this kind of very simple pattern. Next up, we'll switch the order of the reverb and the compressor. So the reverb is in front of the compressor, and when we then engage the compressor, the sound will be very fat, because in between the steps, the reverb will be accentuated by the compressor. So turn on the reverb, bringing down the amount to about a quarter of the way, and the damp as well, size about 12 o'clock. And turn on the compressor, bringing up the attack a little bit, so we have a bit of a leeway where the transient can come through. Reducing the release a tad, also the threshold, bringing it down a bit, and the ratio, you can bring it up. And you should adjust these compressor settings to taste. So I'm a little bit loud because the compressor on Europa automatically adjusts the makeup gain. So if you bring down the threshold too much, you'll make your signal be a lot louder. So keep an eye on the clip meter and make sure you don't clip like I just did. So that's the basic patch. A lot of ways to make this more interesting. You can, for example, use the mod wheel and just route it to this filter frequency. And that way you can just bring it up when you play. And you have a very nice tool for build-ups and all that kind of stuff. One more cool trick when you're playing this patch or when you're putting notes into the sequencer is to leave a little bit of space between the chords, so the delay can kind of come in between and it mixes up the pattern a little bit. So if you have a chord like so, let me just quickly record a little chord so you can see what I'm talking about. If you just place them right next to each other, they will just keep the same pattern and won't be that interesting. But if you leave a little bit of space in between, and let me just quickly demonstrate. So this is without the space, adding some space. It just lets the delay ring out and it makes the pattern more interesting, in my opinion. So that's something you can do, and because you have a compressor with fairly high settings, or fairly squishing up the signal fairly well, you have no loss in volume over this kind of part where you take out the notes. So it's still kind of a coherent phrase, just with a different pattern. And last but not least, I promised you to A/B the spectral filter on and off. If you take this off, it sounds a lot more like the basic saw chords. So these you might have heard in a lot of just melodic dubstep tracks. Very similar rhythmic kind of saw chords. Those are a lot more meaty, obviously, because they have a lot more of the harmonics. If we take those out, we end up with a more subtle sound, but if you put a bass under that, it's very smooth. And I enjoy the subtle sound a bit more than the full-on saw. So one last time, this is the patch in action in my new track, Never Over. And if you want to hear the rest, link is in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one of whatever you're having.